The forest trail had become a part of my daily routine, a chance to escape the bustle of work and clear my mind. Each day, I'd walk the winding path, shaded by towering trees and surrounded by the quiet hum of nature. It was peaceful, a slice of tranquility that I'd come to rely on. One afternoon, as I walked along the path, something caught my eye in the distance. Far ahead, barely visible, a figure crossed the trail. It was a quick movement, a mere shadow passing between the trees, gone before I could register any details. For a moment, I stopped, squinting down the path, wondering if someone else was out for a walk. But the figure had already disappeared, leaving me staring at empty space. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was probably another hiker, maybe someone taking a shortcut through the woods. But as I continued walking, a faint unease settled in. The figure had seemed so fleeting, almost as if it hadn't wanted to be seen. I tried to shake off the feeling, but the image lingered in my mind, a shadow that followed me out of the forest. The next day at work, curiosity got the better of me. During lunch, I struck up a conversation with Emma, a coworker who also frequented the trail. Casually, I asked if she'd ever seen anyone or anything unusual while walking there. Her response surprised me. She looked at me, her expression turning serious. "Actually, yes," she said. "Once I was walking along, and right in front of me, this figure crossed the path. It was fast, like it didn't want to be seen. I thought it might have been an animal at first, but it was too tall, too human." She paused, her eyes distant, as if recalling the encounter. It disappeared into the trees before I could get a good look. Gave me chills, to be honest. Her words sent a shiver down my spine. Hearing her describe the same kind of figure I'd seen, vanishing quickly into the forest, stirred a mix of curiosity and dread within me. Emma seemed genuinely unsettled, and I could tell the experience had stayed with her. I wondered if there was more to the trail than I'd thought, something hidden just beyond the trees, out of sight. The thought gnawed at me over the following days. I kept replaying Emma's words in my mind, her description of the figure echoing my own experience. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something to be discovered, a mystery lurking in the forest that I was meant to uncover. The idea of returning to the trail after dark crept into my thoughts, growing stronger each day. One evening, I finally decided to give in to my curiosity. Armed with a flashlight and a jacket, I made my way to the forest, feeling a mixture of excitement and apprehension. I told myself it was a harmless adventure, just a chance to see if there was anything unusual about the trail at night. But as I approached the entrance, the trees looming dark against the sky, I felt a flicker of doubt. I took a deep breath, telling myself I was overthinking it. Flicking on the flashlight, I stepped onto the trail, the beam of light illuminating the narrow path ahead. The forest was silent, the kind of silence that felt heavy, pressing in from all sides. I pushed forward, each step taking me deeper into the darkness, the sense of isolation settling around me like a shadow. As I walked, the familiar path felt strangely foreign, each tree and shadow taking on a different shape in the darkness. The air was cool, and the only sounds were the soft crunch of leaves beneath my feet and the occasional rustle from deep within the forest. My flashlight barely reached beyond the trail, leaving the rest of the forest shrouded in an impenetrable blackness. The further I went, the more I felt as though I were being watched. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of something in my peripheral vision, a movement, a flicker of shadow, but when I turned, there was nothing there. I told myself it was just nerves, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But the feeling of being watched persisted, an unshakable presence that clung to the air. I reached the midpoint of the trail, pausing to catch my breath. The silence pressed down, thick and heavy, filling the darkness around me. For a moment, I debated turning back, but my curiosity held me in place. I scanned the forest with my flashlight, searching for any sign of movement, but all I saw were the empty, silent trees. The feeling of unease grew, wrapping around me like a cold wind, making me wonder if I was alone after all. Just as I was about to turn and head back, a faint sound broke the silence, a soft crunch of leaves coming from somewhere behind me. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned slowly, the flashlight casting long shadows across the trees. There, just beyond the edge of the light, I caught a glimpse of a figure. It was the same shape I'd seen before, dark and indistinct, barely more than a shadow. The figure stood motionless, half hidden by the trees, its gaze fixed directly on me. For a few seconds I felt rooted to the spot, my breath catching in my throat as I tried to process what I was seeing. The figure took a step forward, and a shiver ran through me. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as though it were studying me, waiting for something. The closer it came, the more I could sense a strange, unnatural energy radiating from it, filling the air with a chilling intensity. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I was frozen, locked in place by its unwavering stare. Then, without warning, the figure lunged forward, and my paralysis shattered. I turned and bolted down the trail, adrenaline flooding my system as I sprinted into the darkness, the sound of footsteps pounding behind me. I raced down the trail, my heart pounding as I pushed myself to run faster, each step driven by sheer terror. Behind me, I could hear the figure's footsteps, mirroring my own, closing in with every passing second. I didn't dare look back. The thought of seeing it just behind me filled me with a dread so intense it made my skin crawl. The darkness seemed to close in around me, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I stumbled over roots and rocks. My breaths came in sharp gasps, each one a reminder of how close the figure was, its presence pressing down on me, urging me to run faster. The trees blurred past in a haze of shadows, my focus entirely on the faint outline of the trail ahead. Every muscle in my body screamed for me to stop, to rest, but the thought of slowing down, of letting the figure catch up, was unthinkable. I could feel its presence just behind me, like a dark wave surging forward, relentless and unstoppable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the faint glow of the trail's end, the dim lights from the road just beyond the forest. Summoning every ounce of strength I had left, I pushed forward, my legs burning as I sprinted toward safety. The figure's footsteps were louder than ever, its presence so close I could almost feel it reaching for me. Just as I reached the edge of the forest, I risked a glance over my shoulder. There, framed in the shadows, stood the figure, watching me from just inside the tree line. It was still, unmoving, its gaze locked on mine with a cold intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. The darkness seemed to cling to it, as though it were a part of the forest itself, a being woven from shadow and night. I stumbled out onto the road, collapsing against the cool asphalt, my breath ragged as I tried to calm my racing heart. When I looked back, the figure was gone, swallowed by the darkness of the forest. But the memory of its silent, relentless pursuit lingered, a reminder of the danger I had narrowly escaped. The next day, I couldn't shake the memory of that night, the feeling of the figure's presence pressing in around me, driving me to the edge of fear. I told myself I'd imagined it, that it had been a trick of the light or a product of my own overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something was out there, hidden in the forest, waiting. From that night on, I vowed never to take the trail after dark. Even during the day, I felt a lingering unease whenever I passed by the entrance, a sense of eyes watching from just beyond the tree line. The mornings had always been quiet on my property, a rural piece of land nestled at the edge of a dense forest. Living alone out here meant a certain kind of solitude, one I'd come to appreciate. But one morning, something unusual caught my attention. Just a few feet from my porch, fresh footprints led off toward the woods, each step clearly imprinted in the soft earth. At first, I brushed it off, thinking maybe someone had passed through during the night. But the more I looked, the stranger it seemed. The footprints were large, too large to be from any animal I'd seen, and they appeared to be heading directly into the forest. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, and as the day went on, the thought of those footprints kept gnawing at me. The next morning, the footprints were there again, freshly imprinted in the ground, as though someone, or something, was watching my property. A chill crept over me, a growing unease I couldn't ignore. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe a hunter passing through, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Days passed, and each morning the footprints reappeared, leading toward the forest, always fresh, always seeming to stop just within sight of my property. As the sun set one evening, I stood on the porch, scanning the edge of the woods, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever, or whatever, was leaving those tracks. Just as the light began to fade, I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the forest, barely visible in the dusk, watching me from the shadows. It was too far away to make out any details, but I could see the outline of a person, tall and unmoving, their presence sending a chill down my spine. I called out, but there was no response. I took a step forward, determined to close the distance, but before I could get far, the figure turned and slipped silently into the trees, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. My heart raced as I scanned the woods, but it was as if the figure had melted into the shadows. I returned to my porch, unsettled and unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something in the forest had taken notice of me. The next morning, I awoke to the now familiar sight of footprints near my property, leading toward the forest. The encounter from the previous night replayed in my mind, filling me with a strange mix of fear and curiosity. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The footprints, the figure at dusk, the feeling of eyes on me. I had to know what was out there, lurking just beyond the trees. By late afternoon, I'd made up my mind. As the sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the ground, I grabbed a flashlight and a jacket, bracing myself for whatever I might find. I told myself it was just curiosity, but there was a knot of tension in my stomach, a quiet warning that maybe I shouldn't go. But the pull was stronger, an insistent drive to uncover whatever mystery was hiding in the forest. I took a deep breath and stepped toward the trees, my footsteps echoing in the quiet as I entered the forest. The air felt heavier as I moved further from my property, the trees towering above me, their branches casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. The forest was silent, an almost unnatural stillness that made each step feel louder than it should have been. The deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to change. The sounds of birds and insects faded, leaving only the soft rustle of leaves underfoot and the faint crackle of twigs snapping beneath my boots. Every so often, I'd stop and listen, convinced I could hear faint sounds in the distance. Quiet, almost imperceptible movements, like someone slipping silently through the trees. As I pushed forward, I noticed subtle signs that others had been here recently. Faint disturbances in the leaves, broken branches, and fresh impressions on the forest floor. My pulse quickened as I examined the trail, each mark a reminder that I wasn't alone. I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me, as though someone or something was tracking my every move. I pressed on, driven by a strange compulsion to see this through, to understand what had drawn me into the forest. The trees grew denser, the shadows darker, until I stumbled upon a small clearing. The air here was different, thicker, colder, as if the forest itself had been holding its breath, waiting. I scanned the clearing, my flashlight casting long beams into the darkness, and felt a chill creep over me, the sense that I was no longer alone. The clearing was silent, almost unnaturally so, the kind of quiet that made my skin crawl. The air felt thick, almost charged, and each breath I took seemed louder than it should have been. I swept my flashlight slowly across the space, illuminating the dense tree line that encircled the clearing, my heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. That's when I saw them. Two figures, standing at the far edge of the clearing, partially obscured by the trees. They wore long, dark cloaks with hoods pulled low over their faces, hiding their features. My breath caught in my throat as I took in the sight, my pulse quickening. The figures stood perfectly still, their bodies almost blending into the shadows, watching me in complete silence. I felt rooted to the spot, a chill creeping down my spine as our silent standoff continued. The figures made no move to approach, no sound to break the tension. They simply stood there, their gazes fixed on me, as if waiting, as if I were the one who had crossed into their domain. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but something about their unwavering silence held me in place, a strange compulsion to see what they would do next. The minutes stretched on, each one filled with an oppressive, suffocating quiet. My flashlight shook slightly in my hand, casting a narrow beam of light that barely reached the figures' feet. They didn't flinch, didn't shift. They remained eerily still, watching me with a focus that felt almost inhuman. As I stood there, my mind raced, trying to make sense of the scene. Who were they? Why were they out here in the middle of the forest, watching me without a word? There was something unsettling about their presence, a a feeling that went beyond mere curiosity. It felt like they were guarding something, or perhaps waiting for me to make a mistake. The thought hit me like a shock. I was intruding, stepping into a place I wasn't meant to be. The figure's silence seemed to carry a message, a warning that I had ventured too far. My chest tightened with a growing sense of dread, and I took a shaky step back, realizing that whatever had brought me here, I was in over my head. Just as my nerve was about to break, the figures shifted. Slowly, almost as if moving in unison, they turned away from me and began to retreat into the shadows, slipping back between the trees without a sound. I watched, frozen, as their dark forms melted into the darkness, disappearing one step at a time, until nothing remained but the faint outline of trees against the night sky. For a moment, I stood there in stunned silence, my eyes fixed on the spot where they had vanished. It was as if they'd never been there at all, as if they were part of the forest itself, fading back into the shadows from which they had emerged. The clearing felt empty now, but the memory of their presence lingered, a haunting reminder that I'd crossed a line I didn't fully understand. My heart pounded as I turned and made my way back through the forest. My steps hurried and uneven, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figures reappear, to feel their silent gaze pressing down on me again. But the forest remained still, the shadows deep and undisturbed, as if sealing the memory of my encounter within its depths. Back at home, I locked the door behind me, feeling the cold grip of fear begin to loosen as I entered the familiar warmth of my space. But even as I settled in, the image of the hooded figures refused to fade. Their silent, unwavering stares filled my mind, haunting me in a way I couldn't shake. I poured a glass of water, my hands still trembling as I tried to piece together what I had experienced. The hotel was quiet, tucked away from the busy streets with only a few cars parked outside. It was just what I was looking for, a peaceful, unassuming place where I could relax and get some work done without distraction. I checked in smoothly, the staff polite but distant, as though they were used to giving guests their space. My room was on the third floor, near the end of the hallway. It was simple but comfortable, and I quickly unpacked, settling into the routine of my temporary stay. The silence was almost unnerving, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning unit. As evening fell, I found myself appreciating the solitude, though an odd sense of being isolated crept in. I dismissed it as just the feeling of being alone in an unfamiliar place. The first night passed without incident, though I remember waking up once in the night, my mind hazy with a strange feeling that I wasn't alone. I brushed it off as a dream and drifted back to sleep, the sense of peace restored as morning light crept through the curtains. The following night, as I was getting ready to turn in, the phone rang. I froze, startled by the unexpected sound cutting through the quiet. Hesitantly, I picked up the receiver, half expecting it to be a mistake, or perhaps the front desk checking in. But there was only silence. I waited a moment, listening to the empty line, feeling an odd chill at the back of my neck. I said hello once more, but there was no response, just the faint hum of static. I checked the caller ID display, seeing that the call had come from the room next door. Curious, I glanced at my wall, as though I might somehow hear or sense the presence of the person calling. But all I heard was silence. The room next door was supposed to be vacant, the door locked and dark when I'd passed it earlier. I tried to ignore the strange sense of unease settling in my chest. Maybe it was just a glitch or someone calling the wrong room. But as I hung up the phone, the silence felt heavier, pressing in on me from the walls. The calls resumed the next day, always from the same room next door, each time with silence or faint breathing on the other end. By now, I was certain no one was staying there. The room was dark, the door firmly locked each time I checked. The calls would come at random times, sometimes during the day, sometimes late at night, each one starting the same way. A moment of silence, then the faint sound of breathing, followed by a click as the line disconnected. With each call, my unease grew. I even tried unplugging the phone, but somehow the calls still managed to come through, the display blinking with that same room number. My curiosity quickly turned into frustration. What was going on? Who could be calling me from an empty room? In a moment of resolve, I went over to the room and tried the handle again, finding it locked as always. I knocked once, then twice, but there was no response, only the empty silence pressing in around me. I stood there for a few minutes, feeling an irrational urge to turn back to my room. As I returned to my own door, the hallway felt strangely cold, as though some unseen presence lingered just beyond sight. That night, the calls took on a new and disturbing tone. I answered the phone, already irritated, but this time the silence was broken by a faint whisper, the voice barely audible through the static. I strained to listen, feeling a chill as I realized the caller was describing something I'd done earlier that day, an action so trivial and routine, yet somehow chilling when spoken in that quiet, knowing voice. "How was your walk this afternoon?" the voice whispered, a mocking edge to the tone. My blood ran cold as I tried to make sense of it. How could they know? I hadn't seen anyone while walking around the hotel grounds, and yet, somehow, this voice seemed to know every detail. The line went dead, leaving me sitting in stunned silence. I could feel my heartbeat racing, the reality sinking in. Someone was watching me, tracking my every move. I felt trapped, unable to escape the silent, unseen eyes that seemed to follow me from the shadows of the empty room next door. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was a coincidence, but the dread grew, filling the room until it felt almost impossible to breathe. The next morning, I went straight to the front desk, unable to ignore the strange calls any longer. I explained the situation, detailing each call, each whisper, each disturbing moment of silence. The receptionist listened politely, but her expression remained frustratingly neutral, as though she had heard it all before. When I mentioned the calls were coming from the vacant room next to mine, a strange look passed between her and another staff member. "Probably a system error," she said, her tone flat and dismissive. "Sometimes the lines get mixed up in the older rooms." "But how could someone know what I'm doing?" I asked, my voice rising in frustration. "This is more than just a system error." The staff member's face softened slightly, but she didn't seem willing to engage. Her answers remained evasive, as if discussing the matter any further was forbidden. I felt a chill run through me, realizing that whatever was happening, the staff seemed reluctant to help. I left the front desk, feeling no closer to an answer, my unease growing as I returned to my room, the hotel suddenly feeling more oppressive than before. It felt as though the walls were watching, that something unseen lurked just beyond my understanding. That night, I was on edge, my nerves frayed from the staff's dismissive attitude and the growing fear that something unnatural was at play. I barely slept, half expecting the phone to ring at any moment. And, as if on cue, it did. The shrill sound pierced the silence, and my heart pounded as I picked up the receiver, dreading what I might hear. At first, there was the usual static, followed by the faint sound of breathing. But this time, a voice spoke, whispering words that felt like icy fingers creeping down my spine. "You can't hide," the voice said, its tone chillingly familiar, as if it had known me for years. "I'm always watching." The line went dead, leaving me frozen, the receiver still pressed to my ear. I felt trapped, paralyzed by the knowledge that someone or something was observing me, tracking my every move. Panic surged through me as I realized I couldn't stay here another night, couldn't endure another call from the unseen presence in the room next door. Without hesitation, I began packing, throwing my belongings into my suitcase with a sense of urgency. The room felt colder, the walls somehow darker, as if the hotel itself were aware of my fear. Every rustle, every creak seemed magnified, filling the space with a sense of foreboding. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting the phone to ring again or the shadow of a figure to appear outside my room. As I zipped up my suitcase, I took one last look around, feeling as though I were leaving behind more than just a room. The memory of the calls, the eerie whispers, and the unnerving silence lingered, casting a shadow over the space. I felt a strange pull to stay, as though some unseen force wanted me to remain, to face whatever lay hidden within the walls of this hotel. But my fear overpowered it, urging me to get as far away from this place as possible. With a deep breath, I grabbed my things, opened the door, and stepped into the hallway, the oppressive atmosphere following me as I made my way to the elevator. I kept my gaze forward, refusing to glance at the door to the room next door, fearing what I might see. I checked out without a word, barely making eye contact with the staff as I handed over my key. They accepted it in silence, their expressions unreadable, as if they knew I wouldn't be back. I hurried to my car, feeling the weight of the hotel's presence lifting with each step, the fresh air outside like a balm after the suffocating dread I'd felt within those walls. It began quietly, a minor inconvenience that quickly transformed into something ominous. When the first letter arrived, I noticed it wasn't addressed to me, nor was the name familiar. It was meant for someone living on the floor above, a neighbor I'd never met in the months I'd been in the building. The handwriting was delicate, almost fragile, looping in ways that made the letters blend together. I shrugged it off, figuring I'd drop it by their door when I had the time. But curiosity got the better of me. As the days passed, more letters arrived, along with the occasional package, each bearing the same name. I wondered if my neighbor had left town, leaving their mail to pile up. Still, there was something peculiar about the items themselves. Small boxes wrapped in dark paper, tied with string. Envelopes that looked worn, as though they'd traveled through time before ending up at my door. Each piece seemed to carry a strange weight, an unexplainable wrongness I couldn't shake. They were simple deliveries, yet each one seemed to cast a shadow over my apartment, pulling my attention in ways I couldn't explain. I began keeping them in a pile by my door, assuming my neighbor would eventually claim them. But each time I glanced over, a chill ran through me, as if the letters and packages were waiting for something. It wasn't long before they began to feel like uninvited guests, taking up space, altering the atmosphere of my home in subtle ways. I told myself it was just my imagination, but that did little to ease the sense that something strange was beginning. By the time the fourth package arrived, I knew there was something distinctly odd about these deliveries. I hadn't opened any of them, resisting the urge to violate what felt like the neighbor's private affairs. Yet curiosity gnawed at me. Each package and letter exuded a bizarre energy, as if I could feel their presence even when they were out of sight. I spent more time thinking about them than I cared to admit. One night, I gave in. I picked up the nearest package, examining it under the dim light in my kitchen. The paper was rough, the string knotted tightly as though sealing something within. My fingers lingered on the edges, tracing the faint, uneven marks along the wrapping, like scratches left by claws. It felt strange, and I set it down, wondering about the items accumulating in my apartment. What sort of person was my neighbor? Why did these things feel as if they carried a purpose beyond delivery? I started to feel paranoid, glancing at the door every so often, half expecting someone to appear, claiming what I'd unknowingly collected. But there was no one, only the silent, growing pile. The items seemed to grow heavier with each passing day, filling my thoughts until they lingered at the back of my mind like a slow-burning discomfort. My home no longer felt entirely my own. I knew then that I had to meet the person these deliveries were meant for. It happened one evening. A sharp knock startled me out of my thoughts, and when I opened the door, I found myself face to face with a woman I'd never seen before. She was slight, pale, her features framed by jet black hair cascading over her shoulders. Her eyes darted nervously around the hallway, as if expecting something to lunge out of the shadows. Her clothing seemed out of place, dark and heavy, resembling the style of an old, forgotten era. She looked up, meeting my gaze briefly before her eyes settled on the pile of letters and packages by my door. "I'm sorry," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "I believe you have some things for me." I stepped back, surprised, gesturing to the items. "Are these yours?" I asked, watching her expression shift from anxiety to relief, and then to something harder to define. She moved quickly, gathering them up, cradling the packages as though they were something precious. But before she left, she paused, casting a glance over her shoulder. "Thank you," she said, her tone carrying a weight I didn't understand. Then, after a moment's hesitation, she added, "Be very careful." And with that, she was gone, disappearing down the corridor without another word. I stood there for a long time, her warning echoing in my mind, trying to shake the sense of dread that settled in after she left. Her words clung to me like a veil, suffusing the apartment with an unsettling tension I couldn't dispel. I hadn't fully processed the woman's strange visit when, moments later, there was another knock at the door. I froze, feeling an instant pulse of alarm. Slowly, I moved toward the peephole and peered through it, my breath catching at what I saw. A man stood just outside, his posture stiff and unnatural, his face partially obscured by the dim light in the hallway. He looked out of place, his expression unreadable, eyes fixed on my door as if he could see me through the wood. There was something deeply unsettling about his presence, a kind of stillness that felt wrong, as though he was simply waiting for me to answer. The knocking resumed, soft yet insistent, and each sound jolted through me, stirring an inexplicable dread. I stood motionless, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Part of me wanted to open the door, confront him, demand to know what he wanted. But a stronger instinct kept me in place, urging me to stay hidden, to remain unnoticed. I waited, each knock stretching the silence until, finally, the knocking stopped. Through the peephole, I saw him turn, lingering for a moment as if debating whether to stay. Then he left, his footsteps fading down the hall, leaving only an uneasy quiet in his wake. Yet the stillness felt tainted, thick with the memory of his visit and the woman's cryptic warning. I knew, deep down, that whatever this was, it was far from over. After the man's unsettling visit, I couldn't rest. I began to feel like I was being watched, an unseen presence lingering in the shadows of my apartment. Driven by a need to understand, I decided to investigate. The name on the packages seemed like a lead, a piece of a puzzle I hadn't asked to solve but couldn't ignore any longer. I searched online, entering the woman's name along with the address of the building. It took a while, but eventually something turned up, though I almost wished it hadn't. I found scattered mentions, fragments of information buried in local history forums and outdated articles. There was talk of a previous tenant in the building with the same name, a woman known for peculiar habits, reclusive and erratic, according to the posts. One article mentioned her disappearance nearly a decade ago, under unusual circumstances, a case that had never been solved. The comments under the post were filled with vague, unsettling stories about other residents who had received mysterious letters and packages before vanishing without a trace. Each account read like a ghost story, as if I'd stumbled upon some hidden lore that had quietly existed within these walls, a secret that had been waiting for someone to uncover it. The more I read, the more isolated I felt. I hadn't encountered anyone in the building who seemed aware of this history, but I began to wonder if they were simply pretending not to know. Paranoia crept in, tightening its grip. Every creak, every shadow seemed alive with meaning, as though I was not alone. The packages, the woman's warning, the man at the door, each detail felt connected, drawing me into a web I didn't want to be a part of. A few days passed, and I managed to avoid more mail deliveries, almost hoping they would stop. Yet, the dread lingered, a constant reminder of the strange chain of events. One night, unable to sleep, I found myself wandering through the building, quietly exploring the halls and stairwells, my steps echoing in the dimly lit corridors. It was a kind of desperation that led me on, searching for some form of answer, a break in the overwhelming tension. In the basement, I discovered a wall of faded tenant photos displayed in a long, narrow hallway near the utility rooms. I examined them closely, drawn to the images despite the eerie silence surrounding me. There, among the faces, was the woman who had come to my door. Her photograph, taken years before, showed her younger but unmistakable, her expression solemn, distant. Her name was listed beneath it, confirming what I already feared. She had once lived in this building, just as the rumors suggested, and yet, according to everything I'd read, she was supposed to be missing, possibly even dead. I felt a wave of nausea, a sense of being lured into a trap I'd only begun to understand. My skin prickled, and the shadows around me felt oppressive, as if the walls themselves were watching, bearing witness to what I'd uncovered. I left the basement swiftly, feeling as if I'd just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Another knock came at my door a few nights later, long after I'd convinced myself I'd imagined the earlier encounters. I froze, staring at the door, bracing myself for whatever might await me on the other side. Through the peephole I saw her, the woman, as pale and unsettling as ever, though this time she looked frantic, her face lined with urgency. She met my gaze through the door, her eyes wide and imploring. Her hand rested against the door frame, fingers trembling as if she was holding herself back from bursting inside. I didn't dare open it, but her voice was clear, almost pleading as she leaned close. "Please, listen to me," she whispered, her words a barely controlled edge of panic. "You have to leave, now." My heart pounded as I listened to her rapid breathing on the other side. I could feel her urgency, the desperation in her tone. Yet something held me back, an instinct not to trust her, to resist the lure of opening the door. I stood frozen, trapped by indecision, feeling the weight of her warning pressing down, filling the room with an unbearable tension. Her whispered pleas faded into silence, and when I finally found the courage to look, she was gone. After that night, I never saw the woman again, and the wrong orders stopped. My life gradually returned to normal. It was an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon, and I was at my favorite coffee shop, a place where I'd come to relax, read, and escape the day's demands. I'd just settled in, the aroma of fresh coffee filling the air, when I noticed an unfamiliar car parked outside, positioned in a way that allowed its driver a direct view of the shop's front. The car was unmistakably an Uber, the logo sticker displayed clearly on the windshield. The driver, a man in his 40s with a face that bore a quiet, unreadable expression, sat in the front seat, his gaze fixed forward. I tried to brush it off as a standard pickup or drop-off. But time passed and he didn't move, didn't check his phone, didn't show any signs of an actual job. He just watched. I forced myself to ignore it, chalking it up to coincidence, yet an odd sense of intrusion settled over me. I could feel his gaze, lingering and quiet, almost too patient. When I eventually left, he was still there, eyes following me as I walked out the door. Days went by, and I'd nearly forgotten the strange encounter, dismissing it as nothing more than a minor oddity. But that changed on Thursday, as I left the grocery store. There, parked a short distance away, was the same Uber car, its driver's profile unmistakable. He was leaning back in the seat, his eyes shielded by dark sunglasses, yet I knew he saw me. A chill ran through me. Why was he here, of all places? This wasn't a popular spot, not somewhere I'd expect to see a random Uber driver waiting around. He wasn't picking up anyone, and he made no effort to look busy. He was just there, as if he'd anticipated I'd show up. I hurried to my car, feeling his stare linger long after I drove off. Then it happened again. At the park, a place where I often went for a quiet stroll, his car was parked along the curb, engine off, his eyes following my every step from a distance. The randomness of it was unnerving, a silent reminder that he was watching, tracking me without reason. Each time, I forced myself to act natural, as if he were nothing more than a background detail. But the dread was there, sinking deeper into my thoughts. The sightings became more frequent, almost as if he was tracking my every move. By the weekend, it felt like he'd mapped my entire routine, appearing at places even farther from my usual haunts. I could feel the tightening grip of paranoia settling over me. I avoided the coffee shop, switched grocery stores, and altered my schedule, trying to throw him off. But each time, he was there, the same car, the same blank expression. I wondered if somehow he'd gained access to my phone's GPS or found a way to hack my information. I checked every privacy setting I could find, scoured my phone for malware, but nothing seemed amiss. Still, it didn't explain how he always knew where I'd be. The knowledge that he was watching stripped away any sense of privacy, leaving me exposed. I began to dread even leaving my apartment, half expecting to see his car parked nearby each time I looked out the window. Sleep became harder to come by. Each time I drifted off, I was haunted by the thought of him silently observing, waiting for me to make my next move. I wasn't just uneasy, I felt hunted, trapped by someone who knew far too much about my habits and who used that knowledge to invade every part of my life. Enough was enough. I couldn't keep brushing off the sightings or chalking them up to coincidence. This was something else, something calculated, and it had to stop. I spent hours piecing together every detail I could recall, trying to remember the specifics of his car, its make, model, and the partial license plate I'd managed to glimpse. I kept seeing his face in my mind, that blank, almost expressionless gaze fixed on me, waiting. I drove to the police station, clutching my notes, feeling a strange mixture of relief and anxiety as I walked inside. I explained everything to the officer, detailing each encounter, the strange locations, and the way he'd been following my movements without any logical explanation. The officer listened closely, taking down each fact, his expression shifting from polite curiosity to a more serious focus. They assured me they would investigate, that my report would be taken seriously. Leaving the station, I felt a slight ease, like I'd regained a small piece of control over my life. Someone else knew now. Someone else would be looking into this. But even as I drove back home, I couldn't help but check my mirrors, half expecting to see the Uber driver's car trailing behind, lurking in the shadows. I told myself things would change, that soon this unnerving surveillance would come to an end. And yet, the unease lingered, a dark, unsettling reminder of how fragile my privacy had become. After filing the report, I tried to settle back into my routine, hoping the sightings would stop. But even a few days later, the tension lingered, an ever-present shadow in my thoughts. Then, unexpectedly, I received a call from the police. They informed me they'd done some initial digging and had managed to locate the driver based on the car description and license plate fragments I'd provided. The officer's tone was careful as he explained that the driver had a history. There were previous complaints, vague reports of odd behavior from other passengers, but nothing that had led to action. The complaints had always been borderline, subtle enough to dismiss, yet too strange to ignore. Hearing this, I felt a disturbing sense of validation. This wasn't just my imagination, he'd done this before. But there was something more, something unspoken in the officer's words. He hinted that the driver had taken particular interest in passengers who frequented the same places, as if he watched, waiting for patterns to emerge before latching on. The call ended with an assurance that they would continue investigating and keep me updated. Hanging up, I felt a mix of relief and dread, knowing the authorities were involved, but unsure how much that would truly protect me. I couldn't shake the thought that the driver, wherever he was, knew the police were closing in, and that this might drive him to act more boldly. The day after the call, I tried to put the investigation out of my mind, pushing myself to return to my usual routines. By early evening, I was at the park, hoping a walk might clear my thoughts. But as I rounded a bend in the path, my steps faltered. There, standing under the glow of a street lamp, was the driver. He was out of his car, closer than he'd ever been before, watching me openly. A surge of fear paralyzed me as our eyes met. He was expressionless, his face a blank slate, yet something in his stare felt calculated, invasive. This time, there was no car window separating us, no distance to create a false sense of safety. He was just a few feet away, his silence more unnerving than anything he could have said. The world seemed to close in, each shadow deepening around us, trapping me in his gaze. I forced myself to turn and walk away, feeling his eyes on my back with every step. It took all my strength not to break into a run, not to show him the panic that clawed its way up my throat. Once I reached the edge of the park, I glanced back. He was gone, the empty stretch of path lit only by the fading streetlights. But the encounter left a chill that seeped deep into my bones, a wordless warning that this wasn't over, no matter how hard I tried to distance myself. The next morning, my phone buzzed with an update from the police. They'd completed their investigation and had more information about the driver's behavior and motivations. According to the officer, the driver had a record of stalking, a fixation that led him to track certain individuals over extended periods. He had been investigated before, but the cases had never resulted in concrete charges. It turned out he wasn't just a driver, but had a history of invasive surveillance, an unsettling habit that the police had finally been able to document fully with my report. The officer's explanation was clinical, yet the underlying reality sent a shiver through me. The driver had chosen his targets carefully, mapping routines, taking note of daily habits until he felt he understood them entirely. My routine had been cataloged, studied, and silently followed. They assured me he'd been detained and wouldn't be able to continue this behavior, at least for now. I thanked them, feeling an overwhelming sense of relief, but also a hollowness that settled in my stomach. The intrusion had ended, yet the damage lingered, a bruise on my sense of security. I came home that night with the single-minded intention of unwinding. My mind was a blur from the long hours at work, and I wanted nothing more than to collapse into the comfort of my sofa and let the day slip away. Stepping into the familiar space of my apartment, I was prepared for that easy, automatic sense of relief that usually greeted me. But the feeling never came. Instead, an odd sensation washed over me the moment I entered. Something felt off. I couldn't immediately pinpoint what it was, but the space felt subtly altered, as though it was nudging me to notice a change. I dropped my keys onto the table by the door, then looked around with fresh eyes. My gaze landed on the living room, and that's when I saw it. My coffee table had been moved, ever so slightly. It wasn't in its usual spot in the center of the room. Instead, it sat off-kilter, angled strangely toward the sofa. Puzzled, I took a step forward, scanning the rest of the room. It wasn't just the table. The armchair near the window was positioned at an odd angle, turned halfway toward the wall, and one of the cushions from my couch had been propped upright, as if someone had carefully set it there. These changes were small, almost trivial, yet they collectively created a jarring dissonance. The space felt distorted, like it was someone else's interpretation of my apartment. I tried to brush it off, reasoning with myself as I went about my evening routine. Maybe I'd been so tired that morning that I'd inadvertently moved things around and hadn't noticed. Maybe I'd simply forgotten. But the thought didn't sit right. The room felt tainted, almost hostile, though I had no concrete reason to feel that way. I pushed the uncomfortable feeling down, convincing myself it was nothing, but the seed of doubt had already taken root. When I finally went to bed that night, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched, a prickling awareness that settled deep in my mind, refusing to leave. I lay there for hours, waiting for sleep that wouldn't come, wondering why my own home felt so unfamiliar. The next day, the strangeness in my apartment had only worsened. Returning home, I immediately noticed the changes. This time, they were impossible to ignore. The dining chairs were overturned, one propped against the wall, and another lying on its side. The small cabinet in the hallway had its drawers pulled open, contents strewn about. A vase that usually sat in the corner was now positioned on the kitchen counter, almost as if someone had placed it there for display. I stood there, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. These weren't minor adjustments, not the kind you could dismiss as accidental. Someone, or something, had intentionally rearranged my things, as though mocking my sense of normalcy. My mind raced, desperately seeking a rational explanation. Had someone broken in? The door had been locked, with no signs of forced entry. Could it be that I'd done this myself and somehow forgotten? I dismissed the thought almost immediately, feeling the absurdity of it. There was no way I'd turn my own apartment upside down without realizing it. As I straightened the furniture and returned items to their proper places, I felt a growing sense of vulnerability. My home was supposed to be a safe space, a sanctuary. But now, with each piece of furniture I restored to its original position, that feeling slipped further away. An invisible presence seemed to linger, one that defied logic and demanded my attention. I went through the motions of my evening in a fog, hyper-aware of every creak, every shadow. That night, sleep was out of the question. Sometime past midnight, I was startled awake by a faint sound near the front door. In my half-conscious state, it took a moment to register, but then I heard it again, a soft jingling like keys shifting in a pocket or a hand. I froze, straining to listen, my senses on high alert. The sound stopped, replaced by a deep, unnerving silence that seemed to fill the entire apartment. I lay still, every muscle tense, waiting for the sound to return. When it didn't, I forced myself to sit up, glancing toward the dark hallway that led to the door. It was closed, just as I'd left it, but the image of someone standing outside, lingering with a set of keys, filled my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever or whatever was responsible for the disturbances had grown bolder, coming close enough to announce their presence. I rose slowly and moved toward the door, my bare feet silent on the floor. I reached for the handle and pulled it open, half expecting to see something, anything, that would explain the strange sounds. But the hallway outside was empty, illuminated only by the dim, distant glow of the emergency light. I shut the door, checked the locks, and returned to my bed, though sleep was a distant hope. The idea that someone might have been right outside, close enough to reach for the handle, left me in a constant state of tension, unable to rest. When I returned home the following evening, a strange smell permeated the apartment. It was faint but unmistakable, a musty, earthy scent that had no place in my meticulously cleaned space. I stepped into the living room, breathing in the unfamiliar odor, trying to trace its source. Every room I entered carried the same faint staleness, an odd mixture of dampness and decay that felt foreign, as if it had drifted in from somewhere else. In an attempt to track down the origin, I moved through the apartment, opening windows, inspecting cupboards, even checking the fridge, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. That's when I noticed something small in the corner of the cupboard near the kitchen sink. Nestled between two mismatched mugs was a delicate, tarnished amulet. I had never seen it before. Picking it up, I studied its intricate, unfamiliar design. The metal was cold in my hand, with a strange symbol etched into its surface that I didn't recognize. It felt personal, almost like something someone would carry with them. I held it for a moment, a strange sense of dread flooding over me, as if this small object was a piece of someone else's life that had intruded into mine. My mind spun with questions, but no answers came. I set the amulet down, hoping I'd never see it again. The apartment was no longer just unsettling. It felt like a trap, one that had started closing in around me. And as I lay in bed that night, the faint smell of decay lingered in my mind, intensifying the quiet horror that had begun to consume my life. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of anxiety and fear. Each time I returned to the apartment, I braced myself, preparing for what strange alterations I might find. Yet, no amount of preparation softened the shock. The changes continued to escalate, each one more unsettling than the last. Sometimes it was a chair pushed so close to the wall that it seemed to be hiding from something. Other times it was the eerie positioning of objects, books stacked on top of each other in a perfect, unnatural balance on the edge of my desk. A half-full glass of water moved inexplicably to my bedside table. My apartment, my home, no longer felt like mine. The atmosphere was tense and oppressive, as if the walls themselves were conspiring against me. I found myself flinching at every little sound. The quiet creaks, the subtle hums, even the whir of the refrigerator seemed unnaturally loud. Each noise fed my growing paranoia, an unshakable feeling that I was no longer alone, that some presence was lurking just out of sight, watching and waiting. Daily routines became nearly impossible to maintain. My concentration waned. My mind was constantly occupied with thoughts of the apartment, obsessively replaying each disturbing detail, every inexplicable change. Even at work, I couldn't focus, distracted by the weight of dread that clung to me. By evening, I'd find myself hesitating at the door, reluctant to step inside, and yet compelled to confront whatever new horror awaited me. The amulet was always there, waiting in the cupboard, as if daring me to pick it up again. I avoided it, but the memory of its cold weight in my hand haunted me. It felt like a message, some kind of symbol whose meaning I couldn't decipher, but that held a grim warning meant just for me. The disturbances grew louder, more invasive. At night, I would lie in bed, listening to the faint whispers that seemed to drift from the walls themselves, indistinct murmurs that faded just as I strained to hear them. Footsteps creaked from the floorboards, though I was the only one there. Shadows began to linger at the edges of my vision, fleeting, barely perceptible shapes that darted away whenever I turned to look. The whispers became more frequent, an almost rhythmic sound that would rise and fall, filling the silence with a low, unnerving drone. One night, I found myself transfixed by the amulet again, unable to look away from it. The urge to pick it up was overwhelming, but each time I reached for it, a wave of dread would stop me. The symbol etched into the metal felt like an unspoken threat, something forbidden that I had unwittingly brought into my life. The apartment's atmosphere grew colder, the air heavy with a sense of malice that seemed to seep from every corner. Even in broad daylight, the space felt dark, the light itself somehow muted, as if struggling to push back against the unseen force occupying it. Sleep was a luxury I could no longer afford. I would drift into restless half-sleeps, plagued by nightmares where the amulet was always present, looming large and foreboding. Every sound, every shadow, every object in the apartment felt like a piece of a puzzle I couldn't solve, a sinister riddle, drawing me deeper into a mystery that I had no desire to unravel. The next day I couldn't stand the agony any longer. I packed my bags and left. I had settled into what I thought would be a quiet evening. My building was usually a sanctuary of stillness, a luxury in a city where noise was constant and inescapable. The low hum of the heater and the soft ticking of my clock were usually the only sounds I heard as I unwound at the end of the day. Tonight, though, something was different. A soft, rhythmic bumping reached my ears, faint at first but persistent. It seemed to be coming from the wall I shared with my neighbor. I paused, listening more closely, waiting for it to stop. But the sound continued with a steady, measured rhythm, a muffled beat that almost seemed too deliberate to be accidental. I told myself it was probably just my neighbor doing something late at night, maybe moving furniture or adjusting something heavy. I forced myself to ignore it, telling myself it was normal, that it would stop soon. But as the hours stretched on, the bumping persisted, echoing through the wall with an eerie consistency that made me feel strangely on edge. Eventually, I turned out the lights, trying to dismiss the noise as nothing more than an odd, one-time occurrence. But as I lay in the dark, the rhythmic thumping continued, each bump slicing through the silence like a heartbeat out of place. I closed my eyes, trying to ignore it, but the sound filled my mind, an inexplicable intrusion that refused to leave. I finally drifted off to sleep, but a vague, unsettled feeling lingered as I lay there, as if the walls themselves had begun to pulse with a quiet menace. The next day, the noise returned. I'd nearly convinced myself that I'd imagined it all the previous night, chalking it up to an overactive imagination and a lack of sleep. But as I sat at my desk trying to focus on a project, the sound resumed, almost as if on cue. The bumping was faint but insistent, each beat marking a steady rhythm that sent a chill crawling up my spine. I found myself drawn to the wall, pressing my ear against the cool surface, trying to decipher the source. The sound was unnervingly clear, as though something was tapping on the other side in perfect rhythm. I imagined it could be the result of some faulty plumbing or heating system, but the noise had a human-like cadence, as if someone were tapping out a message, methodical and deliberate. I tried knocking back, testing if it would respond, but there was no change, only the steady, unbroken rhythm continuing as if nothing had happened. The noise followed me through my evening, relentless and inescapable. I found myself flinching at each bump, feeling a growing sense of intrusion. The wall that once marked the safe boundary of my personal space now felt violated, compromised by this inexplicable sound. I turned the TV up to drown it out, but the rhythmic thumping somehow cut through, breaking into my thoughts, demanding my attention. The once familiar comfort of my apartment was fading, replaced by an uncomfortable tension I couldn't shake. After another night of restless, broken sleep punctuated by that persistent noise, I decided I couldn't stand it any longer. My patience had worn thin, and I needed answers. I went next door, hoping my neighbor might be able to explain what was going on. As I raised my hand to knock, a nearby resident happened to pass by, giving me a curious glance. "Are you looking for someone?" they asked, catching my attention. "Yes, I was just hoping to talk to the person in this unit. There's been a lot of noise coming from the shared wall," I said, gesturing toward the door. The resident gave me a puzzled look. "Oh, they're out of town. Left a few days ago, actually. They won't be back for a week or so." A chill ran through me, the weight of their words settling heavily in my mind. The bumping sounds, they shouldn't have been happening if the unit next door was empty. I forced a smile, thanked them, and returned to my apartment. But my thoughts were racing, my nerves on edge. If no one was there, then who, or what, had been making those noises? Back inside, I sat in the middle of the living room, listening to the silence, hoping the bumping wouldn't return. But the peace was short-lived. That same rhythmic tapping started up again, echoing through the wall as if mocking my attempts to find a reasonable explanation. The apartment felt suddenly foreign, the walls no longer solid, no longer safe. I couldn't ignore the growing fear that something inexplicable was sharing my space. The following days were an exercise in endurance. Each night, the bumping resumed, relentless and intrusive. The sound seemed to follow me, echoing not just from the shared wall, but somehow closer, as if it were moving along the walls, trailing me as I moved from room to room. The noise was so rhythmic, so deliberate, that it felt almost alive, as though it was marking time in some twisted cadence. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was trying to get my attention. The rhythm grew louder at night, filling my bedroom with its unnerving beat, reverberating in my mind long after it had faded. I would sit in bed, paralyzed with a mixture of fear and helplessness, my heart racing each time the sound shifted, growing closer, more insistent. My apartment, once a place of refuge, had become a cage, and I was trapped inside with something I couldn't see, something I couldn't understand. I found myself pacing, my nerves frayed and raw, wondering if I was losing my mind. I tried everything to drown out the noise, but nothing worked. The bumping was always there, an inescapable pulse that made my skin crawl. Every beat felt like a countdown, a slow, steady approach towards something I couldn't comprehend. I began dreading the nights, knowing that the relentless rhythm would return, haunting the quiet darkness with its steady, unyielding presence. The noise had become unbearable. I could no longer think, no longer sleep, no longer feel safe within the walls of my own apartment. Each day the bumping grew louder, more persistent, its rhythm relentless and inescapable. My sanity felt stretched thin, my nerves frayed, and my body exhausted from the constant tension. I knew I couldn't go on like this. I had to escape, even if only for a night. I packed a small bag and called a friend, asking if I could stay over. Just stepping out of my apartment brought a sense of relief, as though I'd escaped a suffocating trap. The quiet outside felt foreign, almost unnatural, after the constant rhythm that had invaded my mind. At my friend's place, I finally felt a flicker of peace. The absence of that maddening sound allowed me to breathe again, to think clearly for the first time in days. But as the night wore on, the peace began to wane. I found myself straining to hear, my mind haunted by an echo of the noise I'd left behind. In the quiet of my friend's apartment, the phantom sound returned, so faint it was almost imperceptible, but there nonetheless, a rhythmic tapping that seemed to follow me. Sleep came fitfully, tainted by a lingering sense that I couldn't escape the noise, that it had imprinted itself on my mind. The next day, I returned home, hoping that maybe the break would have somehow stopped it, that the sound would have faded. But as I stepped through the door, the silence felt unnaturally thick, as if the apartment itself were holding its breath. Then, with an almost taunting familiarity, the bumping resumed, faint at first, then growing louder, as if it had been waiting for my return. The apartment no longer felt like my own, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the sound wasn't just in my walls but somehow inside me as well. Desperate for answers, I began researching the building, hoping to find some rational explanation for the noise that had taken over my life. Hours of searching led me to a piece of the building's history I hadn't known before. Decades ago, a tenant in my neighboring apartment had passed away under unclear circumstances. It was an unsettling revelation, a fact that seemed to echo with the rhythm of the noise I'd been hearing. The more I uncovered, the deeper the unease settled into my bones. There were rumors of strange occurrences in the building after the tenant's death, stories of sounds in the night, strange disturbances that drove residents to leave. My apartment, I realized, had a history I'd been blissfully unaware of when I first moved in. Now, it felt as though that history was seeping through the walls, coming alive in the form of this maddening rhythm. The walls no longer felt like a barrier, but rather a trap, something designed to contain whatever presence seemed to be reaching out. The bumping noise, once an annoyance, had become a sinister reminder, a message that something long forgotten was still alive within these walls. The sound seemed to grow stronger as night fell, filling my apartment with a dark, pulsing energy that left me unable to sleep, unable to think, trapped in a waking nightmare. I couldn't take it any longer. The sound had taken over every waking moment, and I knew I was reaching a breaking point. In a fit of desperation, I pounded on the shared wall, my fist striking the surface in a frenzy, my frustration boiling over into anger. I screamed into the silence, my voice raw and hoarse, demanding that the noise stop, that whatever was behind it leave me in peace. But my outburst only seemed to intensify the noise. The bumping grew louder, filling the apartment with a pressure so intense it felt like the walls were closing in around me. The rhythmic pounding reverberated through my bones, echoing in my skull until I felt like I was dissolving into the sound. I sank to the floor, pressing my hands against my ears, trying to shut it out, but it was useless. The noise was everywhere, consuming every part of me. It felt as though the sound was no longer coming from the walls but from within me, as if it had found a way to invade my very mind. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't escape. The noise had become a living thing, a relentless force that had taken over my life. In that moment, I knew I couldn't stay here. Whatever it was, whatever it wanted, I had to get away before it took everything.